A struggling woman returns to her grandfather's forgotten house and discovers a hidden door he once warned her never to open. She believes it's just another relic of the past until she steps inside. What lies beyond that hidden door isn't just a secret buried underground, but a truth powerful enough to change her life forever. Subscribe for more powerful stories and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The letter arrived on a rainy Wednesday morning, tucked beneath a stack of grocery store flyers, and sealed with a crest Abigail didn't recognize. She was 43, single, and barely holding on in a crumbling apartment in Detroit, where the heating clicked like a dying heart, and the rent kept rising faster than her income. The envelope felt out of place, like it knew it didn't belong among coupons and overdue bills. Abigail set it on the table and forgot about it until night. When the quietness pressed in too heavy and the ceiling cracks looked more like fault lines, the letter, formal and cold, informed her that her grandfather, Henry Whitlock, had passed away 3 weeks prior. She hadn't spoken to him in years, but somehow she was his sole heir. There was property involved, one line. A private residence with auxiliary facilities in rural Vermont, assessed value negligible. Her first thought wasn't joy, it was dread. Her own mother had once called Henry's home a bunker for madmen. Nobody had visited him. Nobody wanted anything to do with that place. But Abigail was desperate. And when desperation meets unanswered questions, it doesn't ask for permission. It just packs a bag and drives. 2 weeks later, Abigail was standing on the shoulder of a narrow, frost-bitten road in rural Vermont, gripping the wheel of a car that coughed with every mile. She hadn't told anyone exactly where she was going. Truth be told, she wasn't even sure herself. The coordinates the notary had emailed her were barely recognizable on Google Maps, just a faint gray line winding through the hills, ending in what looked like forest. She'd left her apartment with no more than a duffel bag, a flashlight, and an old thermos filled with coffee that had gone bitter with time. The road turned to gravel, then dirt. Trees pressed close on either side, as if reluctant to make room. When the house finally came into view, she slowed the car almost without thinking. It wasn't a house, not really, not in the traditional sense. The structure looked like it had surrendered to the earth decades ago. From the front, it wore a weathered wooden face, simple, sagging slightly, but the rest of it disappeared into the slope of the hill behind it. Soil climbed up the walls like a blanket drawn over tired shoulders. Grass grew on the roof. It didn't look abandoned, it looked absorbed. Abigail stepped out into the cold. Her boots sank slightly into damp earth, and the scent of wet pine and iron filled her nose. There were no power lines, no mailbox, no tire tracks. The only thing that suggested life was the fact that the front door wasn't padlocked. Her hand hovered over the handle for a moment. The last time she'd seen her grandfather, she had been 15. He'd been sitting on the edge of a hospital bed, whispering to her mother in tones too low to hear. Abigail had reached for his hand, but he'd simply smiled, distant, tired, and said, "Some doors shouldn't be opened unless you're ready to carry what's behind them." At the time, she thought it was nonsense, some cryptic thing old men say when they want to feel important. But now, standing before this half-buried house, the memory surfaced with chilling clarity. She turned the handle. The door groaned open like a sigh released too late. Inside, the air was cool and still. Light crept in from narrow windows set high in the walls. The space was modest, sparse, almost surgical in its organization. A bed, a table, shelves lined with sealed jars and tools arranged with mathematical precision. Dust gathered only where it had been allowed. Abigail stepped inside and felt the weight of silence press against her. It wasn't the kind of silence she knew from her apartment, broken by distant sirens or footsteps overhead. This was ancient quiet, layered, as though the hill itself had absorbed all sound and kept it close like a secret. She placed her bag down and moved slowly, running her fingers along the edge of the table, the handle of a kettle, the worn wood of the chair. Nothing here was decorative. Everything had purpose. Everything waited. She didn't expect to cry, but she did. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the way the air didn't judge her. But in that moment, surrounded by the forgotten belongings of a man everyone else had abandoned, Abigail felt more seen than she had in years. She slept that night fully clothed on the narrow bed, wrapped in a wool blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. The cold never bit. The house held the temperature like it remembered how. By morning, the frost outside had thickened. Her car sat still, unbothered. No signal, no call, no deadlines, just the weight of breath in her chest and the quiet question that would not leave her alone. Why would a man live like this and never tell anyone why? Abigail boiled water from the well behind the house and made tea with dried leaves she found hanging in small bundles. She ate from sealed jars. The food was good, clean, preserved in a way that suggested knowledge, not luck. As the sun moved through its low arc, she moved through the rooms again. Slower this time. Looking. Feeling. And that's when she noticed it. A breeze. A faint draft along the floorboards. Steady. Cool. Purposeful. She crouched and placed her hand on the ground. There it was air, moving where no vent should be. Her eyes followed the current to a seam in the floor she hadn't noticed before. The boards didn't quite match. The grain ran differently, and just along the edge, scratches soft, worn, like something used often and then forgotten. A hidden door. She didn't open it, not yet. Instead, she stood up slowly, heart pounding in a way she hadn't felt since childhood. Her grandfather hadn't built a house. He'd built something else, and it was waiting. It took Abigail 3 full days to gather the courage to open the hidden door. She didn't talk herself into it. Exactly. She didn't pace the floor or make a checklist or try to rationalize. She just lived, boiled water, ate quietly, sat near the stove and listened to the house breathe. And beneath it all, that thin current of air continued to rise through the floor like a whispered invitation. On the 4th morning, before the sun had fully risen, she knelt beside the uneven boards. Her fingers moved instinctively now, tracing the worn grooves, the faint scratch marks that had been smoothed by time. The seam was clear under the dust, too deliberate to be an accident. She pressed her palm flat, exhaled once, and pulled. The wood lifted with the sound of old memory groaning. Reluctant, but not resistant. Beneath it, a ladder descended into shadow. The air rising from below smelled of dry earth, old wood, and something colder than time. Not rot, not damp, something preserved. She hesitated, the memory of her grandfather's words echoing louder than ever. Some doors shouldn't be opened, but they already had been, by her. And the silence wasn't trying to stop her. It was watching. Abigail took the first step, then another. The ladder creaked but held. Her flashlight carved a beam into the dark below, revealing stone walls, thick beams, and smooth-packed earth. It wasn't a cellar. It wasn't a basement. It was something else. A room unfolded beneath her, then another. The underground space stretched farther than the house above, divided into sections, each one with purpose. Shelves lined the walls, holding jars sealed with wax, crates marked in faded ink, and tools hung with almost ceremonial precision. The deeper she stepped into the space, the more it unfolded. There was a logic to it. Ventilation shafts, drainage channels, sloped floors. This wasn't a hole in the ground. This was a system, a design, a memory built in timber and earth. She passed what looked like storage stalls, curved indentations in long wooden racks. Maybe for animals. Maybe not. Everything was clean, dry, quiet. Then, in the farthest chamber, she sought a long wooden table, aged but unbroken, and atop it a notebook. Abigail approached slowly, her boots silent on the packed floor. The notebook's leather cover was worn soft. Corners curled like old leaves. She opened it gently. Inside, the handwriting was small, neat, economical. Numbers, diagrams, observations. Years of them. Charts tracking temperature and humidity, airflow notations, calculations on storage decay, spoilage rates, seasonal adjustments. This wasn't a man running from the world. This was a man building one. Her fingers stopped on a page that had been marked with a fold. A simple note in clean script. Tested the west stall again. Consistency holding. Nothing grows in chaos. Abigail sat down slowly on the edge of the bench. Notebook still in her lap. The flashlight beam shifted as her hands trembled. He had lived down here. Not in body, maybe, but in intention. She closed her eyes and saw him. Henry Whitlock. The strange, quiet man everyone had dismissed. The man who left the city behind and was spoken of only in sighs and eye rolls. But down here, he had built something that worked, something that endured. Not because he feared collapse, but because he understood it. Understood how systems rot when they chase speed and noise and flash. This was none of that. This was silence, order, purpose. And she wasn't just standing in a secret. She was standing inside a legacy. Abigail turned the page again. A small diagram outlined airflow from the shaft to the storage wall. Another note beside it. If someone finds this, don't try to scale it. Just keep it breathing. She closed the book, tears catching at the corners of her eyes before she even realized they were forming. This wasn't just a bunker. It wasn't a fallout shelter or a doomsday vault. It was a choice, a refusal to waste, a promise to live sustainably, not reactively. She looked around at the stillness, at the wood that hadn't buckled, the air that hadn't soured, the food that hadn't spoiled. Henry hadn't warned her because he was afraid. He'd warned her because he knew. Once she opened the door, she wouldn't be able to go back, not just physically, mentally, spiritually, because once you see something that works quietly, intentionally, honestly, the noise of the outside world suddenly feels unbearable. And that's what this place was, unbearable truth. The kind that makes you weep. The kind that makes you stay. In the days that followed, Abigail moved through the house with a different kind of awareness. She still boiled water, swept the floor, rationed food like before, but now, every step carried weight. Not the heaviness of burden, but of responsibility. Something had shifted. Or maybe she had. The underground space was no longer a hidden curiosity. It was a living mechanism. Every airflow, every quiet creak of timber, every shelf carefully arranged, it all hummed with purpose. The deeper she understood it, the more she realized this wasn't survival. This was sovereignty. For years, Abigail had measured success in invoices, rent payments, job offers that led nowhere, and hours spent refreshing email inboxes like they held salvation. That city life had taught her to hustle, to stretch herself thin, to adapt to chaos, but here, adaptation had a different meaning. It didn't mean compromise, it meant calibration. And her grandfather, the man they all thought had failed at life, had calibrated his down to the exact temperature of the soil. She reread the notebooks every morning. They weren't journals. They were blueprints for endurance. There was no panic in his notes, no sense of desperation, just refinement, over and over again, tiny adjustments. Water placement, shelf spacing, moisture control. Each entry whispered the same quiet truth: stability isn't found. It's built, choice by deliberate choice. By the end of the week, Abigail stopped checking her phone. Not because it still had no signal it didn't, but because she no longer expected it to offer anything worth receiving. She began storing food from the house up above down into the lower space. Slowly, cautiously, not out of need, but out of trust. She rearranged jars based on her grandfather's diagrams, shifted baskets of root vegetables into the cooler stall, kept dried herbs near the airflow shafts like he noted in the margins. Each move was a dialogue between generations. Each step into that earthen space felt like slipping into the rhythm of someone who had understood life more deeply than anyone gave him credit for. And with each small task, Abigail's internal panic, the constant noise she'd lived with for years, began to quiet. The fear of not having enough, the shame of not being successful, the exhaustion of being always on. Gone, or at least muted beneath the grounding silence of stone and soil. One night, as rain tapped softly against the hillside, she sat at the old kitchen table upstairs, notebook open in front of her. Not Henry's this time. Hers. The paper felt stiffer than she remembered. Her handwriting, hesitant at first, grew steadier line by line. The carrots held 4 days longer in the lower shaft. The air there is different, colder, but not biting. The place listens, like he said. Maybe I should listen too. She paused. The candle flickered nearby. The stove crackled once, softly. It was the first time in months she wasn't writing for work, for money, for someone else's deadline. She was writing because something in her needed to be remembered. And suddenly, she understood something that made her breath catch. Henry hadn't vanished into obscurity. He had chosen a different metric of meaning. He hadn't failed. He had simply refused to perform. There was a difference, one she had never been taught to recognize. She whispered aloud to the empty room, as if he might still be listening. "I'm sorry we misunderstood you." The silence answered kindly. The next morning, she opened one of the sealed jars from the lowest shelf of the underground space. Inside were pickled green beans, sharp, vibrant, still crisp after all those years. She ate them slowly, savoring not just the taste, but the patience it had taken to make them last. No preservatives, no expiration dates, just knowledge and time. She wasn't sure what would come next. She didn't have a grand plan or a roadmap, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel lost. She felt aligned. Her grandfather hadn't left her money. He hadn't left her advice. He'd left her something far rarer, a system that didn't need rescuing, a way of life that didn't need approval, a rhythm that didn't apologize for being slow. And all he'd asked silently, humbly, was that if someone ever opened the door, they wouldn't try to own it. They'd let it breathe. And finally, she understood what that meant. The opportunity didn't arrive with fanfare. No one knocked on the door offering answers or fortune. It came, instead, in the form of a neighbor, or at least, someone who used to be one. Abigail was outside clearing fallen branches from the edge of the narrow road, one gray afternoon when the truck rolled up an old Ford with faded blue paint and the kind of engine that announced its arrival long before it came into view. The man behind the wheel looked to be in his 60s. Weathered face, mismatched gloves, a quiet way of observing, like someone who'd learned that small towns speak louder with silence than with words. "You the one living at the Whitlock place?" he asked, nodding toward the hill. "I am," Abigail replied, brushing hair from her face. He gave a grunt that might have been approval. Heard someone finally came back. "I'm Mason, used to know your grandfather, back when he let people know he existed." She smiled. "I think I'm starting to understand why he stopped." Mason stepped out, stretched his back with a groan, then motioned toward the bed of his truck. "Lost half my apples last year. Stored 'em like I always do. Garage bins, thought it was good enough. Wasn't. Came out mush by December." There was no sales pitch in his voice, just quiet regret. She didn't think before speaking. "I have a space under the house," she said slowly. "Cool, dry. Built for keeping things like that. It's stable." Mason's brows lifted. He kept that running. "It runs itself," she replied. They stood there for a moment, neither of them rushing the conversation. Finally, he asked, "Think it could hold a few crates?" She hesitated, not from doubt, but from reverence. That space below wasn't just storage, it was sacred, in a way. But something in her gut said this was right. "Yeah," she nodded, "it could." The next morning, Mason returned with 2 wooden crates of apples, each one marked with care. They carried them down together. Abigail showed him the airflow paths, the shelving system, how she rotated items for consistency. He said little, just listened, nodded, and placed his crates with surprising gentleness. Weeks passed. Abigail checked the apples daily at first, then less often. They held firm, fragrant, untouched by rot. And when Mason came to retrieve them, he bit into one right there by the porch, nodded once, and handed her a folded envelope. She started to refuse it. He held up a hand. "It's fair. You saved a year's worth of work. You'll get more of us coming by." And he was right. Word traveled not loudly, not like wildfire, but like a river cutting quietly through stone. A woman with backyard goats asked about cheese storage. A retired beekeeper came by to talk honey. Someone left a small sack of potatoes on her step with a note. "Could you—" Abigail didn't put up signs, didn't post anything online. She didn't have to. People who needed it found it. And with each crate, each sealed jar, each whispered thank you, the underground space took on a new rhythm, not louder, just fuller. She adjusted shelving to accommodate weight, took careful notes, referred back to Henry's journals with new eyes now, not just as a granddaughter, but as a caretaker. Money began to come in, not piles of it, not enough to brag about, but enough to matter. Enough to pay for supplies, to fix the leaky window, to stock staples without worry. For the first time in years, she could breathe without a calculator running in her mind. But the change wasn't just financial. It was internal. She no longer felt invisible. Not because others saw her, but because she did. Every small act measuring moisture, adjusting airflow. Turning a jar became a thread in a life that felt stitched together again. It was humble work, quiet, no glory, but it gave her something the city never had. Continuity. One night, as she recorded temperatures in the notebook she had begun to fill, she paused at the last line and wrote, "He didn't build this to hide from the world. He built it so someone could step into it when the world stopped making sense. She set her pen down and looked toward the floor, toward the hidden door beneath her feet. It was no longer just his system. It was theirs. And now, for the first time, it had purpose beyond memory. Winter came in quietly that year, no grand announcement, no storm, just a steady shift in light, a crispness in the air. The way frost started tracing lace along the window panes. Abigail felt it in her bones before she saw it in the trees. But unlike the winters she'd known in the city, harsh, rushed, filled with bills and broken heaters and the gnawing anxiety of survival, this one arrived like an old friend. Predictable, measured, familiar. She had prepared for it without realizing. By now, the underground space was in full rhythm. Jars of fermented vegetables sat in dark corners with quiet confidence. Apples rested in crates spaced just right to allow the air to flow. Honey, onions, root crops, cheese from a neighbor stored carefully under her supervision. Each item labeled, logged, and monitored not obsessively, but attentively. She wasn't just maintaining her grandfather's system anymore. She was refining it, improving it, owning it. Abigail began making small adjustments based on her own observations. She noticed how the airflow changed depending on the wind outside. She mapped how condensation formed differently depending on where the jars were placed. She rerouted 2 small drainage channels using stones she'd pulled from the slope behind the house. She never would have imagined herself capable of this kind of work. Precision had once terrified her. She was a woman of words, of vague goals and scattered to-do lists. But here, in the rhythm of storage and airflow, in the slow language of preservation, she found something surprising. Clarity. For the first time in her life, she trusted her own thinking. No one told her what to do. No one hovered. No one evaluated her performance. And yet, she worked harder than she ever had. Not from fear, but from connection, from purpose. Each morning began the same way she climbed down the ladder into the underground room before the sun fully rose. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The cool, steady air grounded her. The silence was no longer heavy. It was stabilizing like a breath held by the earth itself. She took her tea there sometimes, sitting at the long wooden table where her grandfather's first notebook still lay. She never moved it. It was the origin, the root. But beside it now was her own notebook full of careful observations, gentle corrections, and questions she was beginning to answer herself. It wasn't just her thinking that changed. Her posture did too. She stood straighter, spoke more clearly, said no when she needed to. She set boundaries with clients if you wanted to store something. You had to follow her system. No exceptions. She no longer apologized for not being what others expected. Not a professional woman in the city. Not a lost granddaughter living off a dead man's legacy. Not a recluse. Not broken. She was a steward of space, of rhythm, of a knowledge deeper than textbooks. Neighbors began coming not just to store things, but to learn, to ask, how do you know how much airflow is enough? Why does it stay so dry in here? Could I build something like this? And she answered not with ego, but with quiet confidence. One evening, a young woman named Elsie came by, wide-eyed and full of questions. She'd just bought land nearby and didn't know where to begin. Abigail walked her down into the space, explained everything, slowly, carefully. When they came back up, Elsie said something that stayed with her for days. You don't talk like someone who inherited this. You talk like someone who built it. And Abigail just smiled. 'Cause in a way she had, not the beams, not the walls, But the system, the trust, the belief in its value, that was hers now. That night, as snow began to fall in soft flakes against the porch roof, Abigail lit the old stove and sat by its warmth. She watched the flames reflect off the notebook in her lap and whispered, almost without meaning to, "I'm not afraid of the future anymore." It wasn't a dramatic revelation. There was no music swell, no cinematic crescendo, just a deep, steady knowing. She had changed not into someone new, but into someone true. And the house, solid, humming, patient, had been waiting all along for her to arrive. The letter came in early spring. Not from a neighbor, not handwritten. This one arrived with a logo in the corner, printed on thick white paper, and the kind of language that sounded polite, but meant business. It was from a development firm. Abigail read the first sentence 3 times before setting it down. They were interested in acquiring properties in the area, the letter said. The firm had noticed the unique structure of her grandfather's home and believed it had commercial potential. They mentioned the slope of the hill, the natural insulation, and a vision for modern, sustainable redevelopment. They offered more money than she'd seen in a long, long time. For a moment, she just stood there, hands trembling not out of temptation, but fury. They didn't understand it. They didn't see it. This house, this system, this way of life, it wasn't potential to be exploited. It was proof that something could work quietly, sustainably, without spectacle or greed. She didn't respond to the letter. Instead, she filed it away in a drawer beneath the sink and went back to her notebooks. But the world doesn't like being ignored. Soon after, people began to show up. A man in a blazer and hiking boots knocked on the door, smiling too wide. He said things like expansion opportunity and community revitalization. Another woman stopped by, asking about zoning and safety permits. Then came the complaints. An anonymous tip sent an inspector to her door, clipboard in hand. Abigail welcomed him in. She had nothing to hide. The storage system was documented, the structure stable. Her grandfather had been meticulous, and now so was she. The inspector left quietly, impressed, maybe, or confused. But the pressure didn't stop. Whispers, questions, hints at what the land could be. She stood on the hill one morning, the sun barely touching the frost-hardened grass, and watched as a black SUV turned slowly at the bottom of the path. Paused, then drove on. That's when she knew. The house wasn't just a sanctuary anymore. It had become a threat to people who didn't understand that value could exist without profit, that systems could serve without being monetized. But Abigail had learned something her old life had never taught her. You don't have to run just because the world knocks louder. She hired a lawyer, registered the house as a working preservation site, filed the paperwork, filled out the forms, jumped through every bureaucratic hoop they placed in front of her. It was exhausting. It was maddening. But she did it. Every time she felt the weight pressing in the noise, the doubt, the temptation to give up, she returned to the underground space. There. The air was always the same. Cool. Steady. Honest. Down there, the world made sense. She didn't expand. She didn't scale. She said no to every investment proposal that arrived in her inbox. She refused to turn the house into a brand. Instead, she refined the system, reinforced beams, repaired vents, created a new ledger that tracked not just what was stored, but who it was for and why it mattered to them. And something incredible happened. People stayed, not just because of the apples or the cheese or the perfect humidity. They came for the stillness. They came to see that not everything has to grow to be meaningful, that some things are sacred precisely because they resist constant motion. One afternoon, a teenager from a nearby town came by with her mother. The girl wandered through the underground space, eyes wide. She turned to Abigail and asked, softly, "Did your grandfather build all this?" Abigail smiled. "He started it. I'm just learning how to listen." The girl nodded, as if that made perfect sense. And maybe, in this world of too much and too fast, it finally did. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Abigail sat on the porch with a mug of tea and watched the shadows stretch across the hill. The house behind her stood quiet and whole, its foundation deeper than any blueprint, its purpose older than money. She thought of the door she had once opened without knowing what waited beneath. She thought of the silence, the shift, the system. She thought of her grandfather not as a strange old man with secrets, but as a visionary who had trusted the earth more than the economy. And she whispered into the dusk, "I get it now. I really do." Abigail thought she had inherited a burden, a decaying house, a forgotten legacy, a man the world had long since written off. But behind that hidden door, she found more than dusty shelves and sealed jars. She found proof that a life doesn't have to be loud to be meaningful. Her grandfather had built something not for fame, not for money, but for resilience, a system that breathed with the land, that didn't collapse under pressure, that quietly resisted everything the world told her she needed to chase. Because true stability doesn't scream for attention. It whispers, "I'm still here." If this story stayed with you, subscribe more quiet. Powerful stories are coming. And if you know someone starting over, share this with them. Sometimes, what we inherit isn't a place, but a way forward.